This week's Piltch Point with Avram Piltch is proudly powered by Newegg. Whether you're building a new computer or upgrading an existing one, Newegg has all of the parts and pieces you need to accomplish your goal. Whether you need a motherboard and processor, RAM, a new SSD, or you need a whole system, you can find them all at Newegg. Every day they've got some daily deals. Right now they've got some RAM and an SSD, which is crazy inexpensive. It's crazy to see an SSD for $19. For those of us who have been following it for a long time. But they've also got full systems, an HP laptop for $399. To see all of the deals that are available today and every day, and to find all of the products that are available, you can go to pilchpoint.live/Newegg. So, show and tell time. I always love Avram show and tell time.
So I got to tell you, I've been keeping this a secret for a while. The secret's out because the embargo's up, but I was one of a very handful of people to get early access to the new Raspberry Pi, the Raspberry Pi 4. Now, I got to tell you that I interviewed Evan Upton, the founder of Raspberry Pi and the CEO of Raspberry Pi Trading, which is the branch of the nonprofit Raspberry Pi Foundation that develops and manufactures the Pis. And back in January, he told me, "Oh, we're not going to be able to do this till next year." And then a couple months later, he called me. He's like, "Oh, things have changed." And what he told me had changed actually is this is what they were working on, but he didn't think they would be able to get the CPU in, I guess, for the price that they wanted in mass production for another year. And then they were able to. So let's have a look at this. Done. All right. Okay, so here it is, the Raspberry Pi 4. Technically speaking, the Raspberry Pi 4B. Now, why is it the 4B? Because this is the form factor that Raspberry Pi has used in their most notably. Hold on a moment, I'll show you a comparison here. This is a 3B plus. This is the latest beforehand, and this is the 4B, right? And you can see they're about the same size. There's like another millimeter or so on this because the port locations have changed a little bit. So what has changed? First thing that's changed is instead of one HDMI connector, you've got two mini HDMI connectors. So you can power dual monitors with this, no problem.
Wow.
In fact, you can power two 4K monitors with it. Now,
Wow.
to be honest with you, it's not very quick when you have two 4K monitors.
Sure.
It can only do 30 hertz on two 4K monitors. If you want one 4K monitor, you can get 60 hertz. And if you want like two 1080p monitors, or, I'm not sure exactly what happens if you try two 2K monitors, but you can have a 4K 60 hertz and one 1080p monitor as well. But anyway, I've mainly got 1080p monitors at my desk. So if you got two 1080p monitors, no problem. The performance is really good. Two 4Ks at 30 hertz, it starts to be a little jerky. So that's one. The other thing is this uses a little bit more electricity, and so instead of having a micro USB connector for charging, it has a USB-C connector for charging, and it requires a charger that is at least 5 volts and at least 3 amps. So the prior one was 5 volts and 2.5 amps. So, not only will you need to have have a charger that does USB-C, but it's got to do at least 3 amps. And of course, there's an official one for $10. The processor is new. This is a 28 nanometer processor as opposed to the 40 nanometer processor on here. This runs at a native speed of 1.5 gigahertz. On the 3B Plus, that's 1.4 gigahertz, so not a huge difference in the clock speed, but with the lower nanometers and everything else. This uses a Cortex A72 architecture, and this is an A53, so it can do a lot more process a lot more instructions simultaneously. So even at the same clock speed or slightly higher clock speed, it's a lot faster. Another really big improvement in the Pi 4B is that it has up to 4 gigabytes of RAM. The previous Raspberry Pis, 1 gigabyte was all you got, and if you had a Pi Zero, that had 512, or you had a Pi A model that had 512. This is available in 1, 2, and 4 gigabyte configurations. This one here I have is the 4. The 1 gigabyte, it costs $35. The 2 gigabyte, $45, and the 4 gigabyte, $55. So $35 is usually what people expect to pay for a Raspberry Pi here. If you want the same amount of RAM you had in the old model, you can pay the same. But if you want more RAM, you got to pay a little more. Now, do you need more RAM? If you're using this as like a computer, which you can, then yes, it's good to have more RAM. If you're using it as like a weather station or something where it's just doing a limited of, interacting with a few sensors, you're not really multitasking and running the GUI on it, 1 gigabyte's probably fine. And if you're using an emulator, which the emulators don't work yet, I should disclaim. One of the things that's going on here, well, let me get to the end of the tour of it, and then I'll talk to you about compatibility. So one of the other things that's really, really important here is you'll see that look at the difference here in USB ports. You can see the colors. Here on my left, there's 2 USB 3 ports. Here on my right, the old model, it's all USB 2. So much faster connections to peripherals, meaning you can do what I was experimenting with this weekend and attach an external SSD to it and actually get pretty decent speeds out of that. Now, like Raspberry Pi, like all Raspberry Pis, it boots off of a micro SD card, and the micro SD slot is twice as fast as it was on here. You can't tell from looking at it, but it maxes out at a theoretical maximum of about 50 megabytes a second versus 25 for this. Either way, that's not great, but if you use an SSD, an external SSD, you will get better transfer rates. So what hasn't changed, it's got your 40-pin GPIO, which makes it compatible with all the old Raspberry Pi accessories, all the old I shouldn't say every accessory. It makes it compatible with the accessories, with any hats or things that you plugged in.
Okay.
But what it won't be compatible with are cases, because they have to have different layouts for the ports, and this ports jut out a little bit more, so you can't use an old Raspberry Pi case with this. And if there's something like a retro arcade system that you want to pop it into, and it was made specifically for the regular old reactor, you got to wait for a new one. The other thing is, it requires a new version of the Raspberry Pi operating system, Raspbian. It requires a new version called Raspbian Buster. Raspbian Buster also runs on the old ones, but if you try to run an older version of the operating system on this, it won't boot. Well, unfortunately, a lot of apps, a lot of developers did not have early access to the Raspberry Pi 4, so they weren't working on, or to Raspbian, so they weren't working on launch day updates to their software. And as sometimes happens with Linux, unfortunately, you change a little bit about the operating system and apps break. Mm-hmm. So, for example, RetroPie, the main arcade emulator that people use, does not yet work. It's been a week and it does not yet work on the Raspberry Pi 4. There will be things that do not yet work on the Raspberry Pi 4 because of the operating system, because they may have to address the slightly different graphics card in this. It uses slightly faster GPU in the SoC. So there will be things that don't work, but they will soon work, for sure. So how does it perform? Well, Raspberry Pi Foundation says that it's 2 to 4 times faster than this, and that's pretty much true. on all the tests that I ran. Now, if you're going to be browsing the web with it, you can competently. It has 802.11ac Wi-Fi and it's got gigabit Ethernet. The Ethernet speed is actually an upgrade too because it was only a third of gigabit on here. If you browse, the internet, it will do competently. It'll be competent. Video playback, unfortunately, still needs, I think, some tweaks because even though it has 4K output, I was not able to play 4K videos on it without them basically coming to a halt. 1080p videos at full 1080p offline video seems to work okay at full screen if I'm in 1080p resolution. If I'm in 4K resolution and it tries to scale up, it gets sluggish. And if I'm doing YouTube video, no matter how fast the bandwidth, if I play 1080p video at full screen, it becomes it's definitely losing some frames. If I play 1080p video in YouTube video in a window where it's not taking up the whole screen, it can be smooth. So I hope those are some things that kind of get ironed out with the software and tweaks to the OS and things like that. But overall, this is an absolutely huge step up. I've said before that everybody should own a Raspberry Pi. Well, if you're going to buy a Raspberry Pi now, everybody should own the Raspberry Pi 4. And if you are wondering which one to get and you're not sure and you just want one to experiment with, you probably should spend the extra money and get the 4 gigabyte model. Now, that being said, I have not been able to find the 4 gigabyte model for sale online in the US. A lot of places still only have the 1 gigabyte model right now. But whichever you get, the performance will be good. And generally, you're not using more than 1 gigabyte of RAM unless you're using this like a computer and you're multitasking. But if you want to try that experience, it's designed to actually be good enough to be used as a computer. Although I wouldn't say that people are going to be throwing away their PCs anytime soon in favor of this. But isn't it good to know that you have something that's this powerful? I mean, the best use cases for it are the ones that we haven't even really seen yet, which is using it for things like machine learning and object recognition and better Internet of Things devices, more so than using it as a standalone PC. Mm-hmm. And you can read a lot more about it on tomshardware.com. We've got a series. We've got a very detailed review with benchmarks. We've got stories on overclocking it, and we've got we will soon tomorrow probably have a story up on what it runs like with an SSD inside. So we continue to mine this product, which is really fascinating. Really fascinating, and I definitely recommend people to buy it. Every self-respecting tech enthusiast could use one of these.
Well, that's really cool. So you said that you're finding the 1 gigs available, and the other models not so much yet.
Yeah, I mean, you can look around online. It changes day to day. I know some people managed to buy the 4s online, but I think some of them bought them from England or things like that. No Raspberry Pi manufactures these in the UK. So Micro Center is a fantastic place. If you live near Micro Center, it's a fantastic place to get these because a lot of their local stores have the 1 gigabyte in stock. And there's a few, online, a lot of places are still getting them.
Got it. Well, I have been thinking, you mentioned enhanced, like, Internet of Things devices. I've been also thinking, like, being able to enhance embedded technologies. Things like, we've seen at CES the last couple of years, we've seen the smart mirrors, and they're always kind of half-cocked ideas, but with something like this, you could really be able to pull lots of data sources together without having to fear the repercussions, right? Because that's always the problem when you're pulling lots of data sources on something with a small amount of RAM or something like that. Being able to process all that starts to become a problem But if you've got up to 4 gigs to be able to display and process weather data and all that kind of stuff, it starts to get way more feasible.
Yeah, I think it will be really good for that. I did run some machine learning, at least one machine learning benchmark on it. Another one I tried, which seems to now, in the latest build of Buster, Raspbian Buster, I cannot get working. But I tried a tutorial that actually works on the old Raspberry Pi, that will do object recognition using Google TensorFlow. And that was way improved on this, but still depends on what you consider slow. So like original Raspberry Pi 3B Plus, I was getting like 0.9 frames per second object recognition with a webcam attached to it. On this, I was getting 1.7. So that's a 70% improvement, but it's still 1.7 frames a second.
Right.
Now, so it depends, but that's that program, right? So it depends on what you're doing with it, obviously.
Sure. I was involved at the tail end of a project. The company I work with was involved with doing an object recognition thing using TensorFlow, and they ended up abandoning Raspberry Pi as their embedded processor because of that. They ended up using it as the thing transmitting the video remotely to the TensorFlow, but they couldn't use it as the processor for exactly that reason.
Well, for what it's worth, and I haven't actually had. I actually want to say I wasn't even. This was another thing where the instructions and tutorials I had to do it didn't work in the latest Raspbian, and maybe they will, when it gets updated. But one thing I have over here that I have not really gotten working well yet, I think I got it working for a minute, but not with live object recognition, is this thing. So this here is a Google Coral USB accelerator, and it is something that a lot of people use with the Raspberry Pi. And this is meant to offload some of that processing directly onto this thing.
Oh.
And it should work better on the 4 because, as you can see, it's USB 3. So it'll have the bandwidth. So that kind of thing could actually be another thing that makes it, more, even better at object recognition.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm looking at the the site for it right now, and they specifically mentioned using it with Raspberry Pi and TensorFlow Lite. So yeah. That's a cool thing I've not encountered. The project we were working on ended up going with a specialty processing computer because they needed like super fast processing, but doing defense projects works that way. Anyway, well, that is a really cool device. I've been following all the stuff you guys have published this week, which has been interesting. I always like Raspberry Pi stuff. So
it's a passion for me, so I really have enjoyed working on it. It was one of those things, though, having early access to it was really great and a wonderful privilege. But new software builds were coming out for it like every day or two. So I tried something, it didn't work, or I'd run a benchmark, and then I'd be, new build came out. Now I got to reinstall everything. So
yeah, that makes sense. Well, I'm glad that you were able to do like a really in-depth dive into it, because it's a fascinating technology, and like you said, it's one of those things that is appropriate for more and more people every day. So obviously, thanks for showing it off. I can't wait to get my hands on one of them, hopefully pretty soon.